In Fallout 4, there are hundreds of tiny details hidden in plain sight, things that exist not to move the story forward, not to change the ending, but simply to make the world feel slightly more real. These are the kinds of details most players walk past without noticing, and that is exactly what makes them perfect for tonight. For example, if you spend time watching the rain in the Commonwealth, you might notice that rainwater subtly changes the way surfaces reflect light. Wet asphalt becomes darker and more mirror-like, especially at night when street lamps flicker through the mist. Bethesda implemented a dynamic wetness shader system that gradually alters material properties instead of instantly flipping textures. It's a tiny visual system most players never consciously register, but it quietly contributes to the game's atmosphere. If you follow Dogmeat closely while walking through ruins, you may notice that he occasionally pauses near hidden containers. This isn't random behavior. Dogmeat has a built-in script that causes him to detect nearby lootable objects and enemies. In fact, there are several locations where he can uncover items that aren't immediately visible to the player. He doesn't always bark about them. Sometimes he simply stands there, waiting. Speaking of companions, every companion in Fallout 4 has unique idle animations that only trigger under specific environmental conditions. Nick Valentine will sometimes tilt his head slightly when standing near pre-war terminals, as if studying them. Piper occasionally adjusts her stance and leans slightly forward when near a public address microphone, even if she doesn't interact with it. These animations are subtle and often easy to miss, but they were deliberately animated to reflect personality. In Diamond City, the loudspeaker announcements cycle through dozens of recorded lines. Many players assume the announcements repeat quickly, but there are actually extended variants that only trigger after long in-game sessions. If you remain in Diamond City long enough without fast traveling, you'll begin hearing less common lines referencing shortages, baseball trivia, or even sarcastic commentary about the mayor's policies. There's also a hidden audio detail inside certain vaults. The hum of the vault generator subtly shifts in pitch depending on how much power the vault is using. While this doesn't mechanically change anything for the player, the sound team layered multiple ambient loops to create the illusion of a working power grid. It's part of what makes vault interiors feel alive rather than static. If you examine abandoned kitchens carefully, you might notice something strange about the skeleton placement. Many skeletons are positioned in storytelling arrangements, sitting upright in chairs, lying beside overturned tables, holding utensils. But the utensils are sometimes deliberately placed in incorrect hands. Developers have explained that this was done to avoid animation clipping issues during environmental placement. The result is subtle and almost invisible unless you look closely. There are also unused voice lines buried deep within the game files. Some were recorded for companions reacting to locations that were later cut from the game. For example, there are partial dialogue triggers referencing alternate Minutemen outposts that were never fully implemented. These lines remain in the files, inaccessible during normal gameplay, quietly hinting at content that almost existed. Settlement building has its own hidden quirks. If you place multiple identical objects side by side, for example, generators, their sound effects will slightly desynchronize over time. This prevents the audio from stacking into a harsh mechanical chorus. The desynchronization happens gradually, meaning you won't notice it consciously, but without it, settlement hubs would sound overwhelmingly loud. Another small detail involves the Pip-Boy light. When turned on in dark environments, it emits a subtle dust particle effect that only appears in certain interior cells. The particles are tied to volumetric lighting zones rather than the Pip-Boy itself. This means some underground locations appear slightly hazier than others, depending on how the lighting was configured. If you drop junk items onto certain slanted surfaces, you may notice that some objects slide while others don't. This isn't random. Fallout 4 assigns different friction values to object categories. Metal objects often slide more easily than cloth or rubber-based objects. It's a small physics detail that adds variation to how clutter behaves in the world. The game's skybox also contains subtle differences depending on time of day. At sunrise, faint contrails can sometimes be seen far above the Commonwealth. They are static textures placed in certain weather conditions, suggesting remnants of pre-war aircraft patterns frozen in time. Most players never look straight up long enough to notice. There's an unusual detail involving Codsworth. If you take him back to Sanctuary very early in the game and stand still long enough, he will occasionally resume trimming non-existent hedges. The animation plays, even though there are no intact hedges left. This behavior is scripted to emphasize his lingering pre-war routines. It's quiet, almost sad, and easy to miss if you're moving quickly. Even loading screens contain tiny inconsistencies. Some 3D models shown during loading are slightly different from their in-world versions. For example, certain weapons in loading screens have minor texture differences compared to their in-game counterparts. These differences exist because the loading screen models are optimized separately to display more clearly under static lighting. The red rocket truck stop sign near Sanctuary flickers differently depending on which direction you approach from. This is due to how the game loads light sources in exterior cells. Approaching from Concord may cause the flicker pattern to begin mid-cycle, while approaching from Sanctuary often starts the animation from the beginning. If you leave a radio station playing and enter certain scripted dialogue scenes, the volume of the radio subtly lowers but does not mute completely. This is intentional. Bethesda avoided fully cutting environmental audio during dialogue to maintain immersion. The result is a faint background hum during conversations that many players never consciously notice. In Good Neighbor, neon lights are layered in multiple transparent textures. If you stand at just the right angle, you can see faint misalignments where two glow layers overlap. This is not a glitch, but a byproduct of how emissive textures are stacked to create brighter signage. There's also a curious detail about Brahmin in settlements. If you assign a Brahmin feed trough, the Brahmin will path toward it occasionally, but not every time they idle. The behavior is governed by a weighted random event list, meaning some Brahmin appear more attentive to their troughs than others. It creates the illusion of personality without actual behavioral variation. The game also tracks how often you open certain doors. While this doesn't affect gameplay outcomes, internal statistics log repeated interactions for debugging purposes. These hidden counters were originally intended for potential adaptive events that were never fully developed. In Vault 81, the medical bay monitors display looping heart rate animations. If you stand and watch long enough, you may notice that one monitor occasionally flatlines for half a second before resuming. This is not scripted story content, but a looping animation artifact, though it unintentionally adds tension. Even the Commonwealth's ambient wind has layers. There are separate wind audio tracks for open fields, ruined urban areas, and forested regions. These layers blend based on player location, creating subtle differences in how the world sounds as you move. And finally, if you wait long enough, in a quiet settlement at night, no music, no radio, you can sometimes hear distant artillery fire, even if you haven't built artillery yet. This sound effect is part of the broader Commonwealth ambient layer, meant to imply activity far beyond the player's immediate view. None of these details change the ending. None alter your perks or companions. They exist simply because someone at Bethesda thought the world would feel better with them included. They are the kinds of details you might only notice if you slow down, stand still, and listen. And perhaps that's the most comforting fact of all, that even in a post-apocalyptic wasteland, the smallest details were carefully placed, quietly waiting for someone patient enough to notice them. Fallout 4 feels large and unpredictable on the surface, but underneath the Commonwealth is a network of invisible systems, constantly making tiny decisions. Most of them operate so smoothly that players never notice they exist at all. Tonight, we'll slow down and look at the hidden mechanics quietly working in the background while you wander the wasteland. Let's start with NPC pathfinding. Every non-player character in Fallout 4 follows something called a nav mesh, an invisible grid placed over walkable surfaces. If you've ever seen an NPC awkwardly refuse to step over a small object, it's often because that object slightly interrupts the nav mesh. Developers manually adjusted thousands of these grids across Boston, which is one reason dense urban areas took longer to build. The reason some settlements feel smoother to navigate than downtown Boston is because settlement zones were optimized later in development. There's also a fascinating system governing random encounters. The Commonwealth isn't truly random. It runs on encounter markers placed throughout the map. These markers check invisible conditions before spawning something. For example, some encounters only trigger if the player hasn't visited that location recently. Others require you to be a certain level. Some even require specific faction progress. That's why you might see a trader under attack in one playthrough, but nothing in another. Speaking of leveling, enemy scaling in Fallout 4 is more complicated than it appears. Enemies don't simply get stronger as you level up. Instead, they swap to higher tier variants. A raider might become a raider psycho or raider veteran, but not every enemy upgrades equally. Some areas are partially locked to certain difficulty tiers. This is why revisiting certain early game locations still feels manageable later, while others suddenly feel far more dangerous. There's also something interesting about how the game tracks your aggression. Internally, Fallout 4 uses hidden crime and hostility counters. If you accidentally hit a settler during combat, the game checks whether the hit was direct, explosive splash damage, or stray fire. Depending on the type, the hostility response changes. That's why sometimes settlers forgive you instantly, and sometimes they turn permanently hostile. Let's talk about VATS. In Fallout 4, VATS no longer fully freezes time. Instead, it slows time to about 10% speed. But here's the subtle part. Bullet travel still exists. That means if you move during VATS, enemy projectiles continue traveling in real time. It's why sometimes you get hit immediately after exiting VATS. The bullet was already mid-flight. There's also a strange hidden statistic involving companions. Each companion tracks hidden affinity decay over time. If you don't trigger positive or negative reactions for long stretches, the system slowly nudges them back toward neutral. This keeps companions from feeling permanently locked in one emotional state. It's subtle and rarely noticeable, but it exists quietly beneath the dialogue system. Settlement happiness is another system many players misunderstand. Happiness doesn't update instantly. It calculates in daily cycles. The system checks food, water, defense, beds, job assignments, and hidden modifiers. For example, having a radio beacon active slightly affects settlement morale, even if you don't notice it directly. The game also penalizes settlements that are too large but lack enough defense relative to population. Here's something you probably never noticed. Birds in Fallout 4 are scripted to fly away before you can shoot them most of the time. This is intentional. The birds are often ambient, fake actors that disappear before bullet impact to reduce physics calculations. Occasionally, though, one will stay long enough to be hit, and that's because it spawned as a full physics-enabled creature rather than a background asset. Water physics are also simplified in a clever way. If you throw an object into shallow water, it sometimes appears to float incorrectly. That's because shallow water zones often lack full buoyancy simulation. Deep water cells, however, do apply simplified buoyancy rules. It's one of those things you only notice if you deliberately test it. There's a hidden camera system too. When you enter dialogue, the camera subtly repositions based on nearby environmental geometry. If there's a wall behind you, it shifts closer to avoid clipping. In open spaces, it moves farther back. This happens dynamically, without you ever seeing the adjustment occur. Now let's talk about debris. When buildings collapse during scripted events, the debris isn't entirely physical. Some pieces are animated models rather than physics objects. This ensures consistent behavior during scenes like bridge collapses or explosions. The illusion of chaos is carefully controlled. Weather in Fallout 4 also isn't purely random. Weather transitions are governed by region-based tables. The glowing sea has its own weather cycle entirely separate from Boston proper. That's why radiation storms feel more intense and frequent there. Some weather conditions also slightly adjust NPC detection ranges, though the difference is minimal. There's a peculiar detail about ghouls. Feral ghouls use a staggered animation system that blends between sprinting and crawling states. If you cripple their legs, they switch to a crawl animation set that still uses partial sprint logic. That's why they sometimes lunge forward in strange bursts, even when injured. Terminal hacking has its own hidden mechanics. The likeness system actually checks letter position, not frequency. That means two identical letters in different positions don't count as likeness. It's a simple system, but it gives the illusion of deeper logic. Did you know the game tracks how long you crouch? There's an internal stealth tracking timer that measures how often you remain in sneak mode. It was originally part of a cut system that would have adjusted certain NPC behaviors based on player stealth habits. Power armor also has a hidden battery decay system. Fusion cores don't drain evenly across all actions. Sprinting in power armor drains cores slightly faster than walking. VATS. Usage inside power armor also adds a small extra drain modifier. These differences are subtle but measurable. Even loading doors have logic. When you exit an interior cell, the game checks whether nearby exterior enemies are actively engaged before deciding where to place you. That's why sometimes stepping outside feels calm, and other times you're immediately in combat. There's a hidden idle timer for the player character as well. If you stand still for long enough in first-person view, your character's breathing animation slightly shifts. It's barely noticeable, but it exists. And here's a quiet fact about the Pip-Boy map. The map lighting changes slightly depending on in-game time of day. It's extremely subtle, but night maps have slightly deeper contrast. Fallout 4 is filled with these invisible systems, constantly calculating small adjustments to make the world feel alive. Most players never see them. They only experience the result: smoother movement, believable reactions, subtle immersion. The Commonwealth may look chaotic on the surface, but beneath it is quiet order. lines of code ticking forward every frame, keeping the illusion intact. And the most relaxing part, you don't have to manage any of it. It simply works quietly in the background while you wander through ruined streets and let the world unfold at its own slow pace. Fallout 4 is filled with objects that don't matter. They don't start quests. They don't grant perks. They don't unlock secret endings. And yet, they exist, carefully placed, often intentionally arranged, quietly waiting to be noticed by someone who slows down long enough to look. Let's begin with pre-war mailboxes. If you walk through residential areas like Sanctuary or Lexington and examine the mailboxes closely, you'll notice that some contain letters. Most are burnt or blank, but occasionally there are legible fragments referencing overdue bills, advertisements, or neighborhood complaints. These notes aren't tied to quests. They don't connect to larger stories. They simply exist to imply that life was ordinary before everything stopped. In certain apartments in downtown Boston, you can find two skeletons sitting across from each other at a table with chess pieces arranged mid-game. The board layout is not random. It's a real chess position, although not a famous one. Developers manually arranged many of these boards rather than letting physics scatter the pieces. There's a bathtub in one ruined house where a skeleton lies next to an empty bottle of Day Tripper. On the edge of the tub, there's a toaster plugged into the wall. The plug, interestingly, isn't actually connected to a working outlet. The cord stops just short of the socket. It's environmental storytelling, but technically non-functional wiring. If you visit certain Red Rocket stations, you might notice that the soda machines sometimes contain Nuka-Cola bottles placed at slightly different angles. These are not physics glitches. Designers intentionally rotated clutter to avoid visual repetition. No two machines are perfectly identical. Let's talk about teddy bears. Fallout 4 has an unusually high number of carefully posed teddy bears. Some sit at dinner tables, some hold weapons, some wear surgical masks. A few are placed in absurd scenarios, like one holding a newspaper in a bathroom stall. Developers have openly admitted they enjoyed hiding these tiny vignettes throughout the map. There is no reward for finding them. They are there purely for atmosphere. There's also something strange about coffee cups. Many office desks contain coffee mugs labeled with phrases like "World's Best Dad" or "Vault-Tech Rep." These mugs appear in multiple locations, but their placements are deliberate. You will often find them near terminals with logged work complaints, as if someone set their mug down before typing their last message. In the Cambridge Polymer Labs building, certain lockers contain folded lab coats. The coats are static objects, not wearable items. Their inclusion suggests a normal workday that ended abruptly. Interestingly, some lockers are slightly ajar but cannot be opened. They exist solely as background dressing. If you enter certain pre-war kitchens, you'll find refrigerators containing perfectly preserved Salisbury steak or Fancy Lad snack cakes. These items remain edible 200 years later. Lore aside, their spawn locations are manually assigned. Refrigerators do not randomly generate food from a universal list. They pull from curated tables depending on building type. In one unmarked location near a collapsed overpass, there's a skeleton sitting in a lawn chair with a cooler beside it and sunglasses still perched on its skull. It overlooks a crater in the distance. There's no note explaining who they were. It's just a silent image of someone watching the end of the world. Let's move to the ocean floor. If you explore the shallow waters near the coastline, you can sometimes find submerged cars placed in unnatural orientations. These were positioned intentionally to suggest tidal displacement after the bombs fell. However, many of these cars are slightly embedded in the seabed due to collision limitations. It's a technical compromise hidden beneath the waves. In Vault 81, certain wall panels have tiny scratches near maintenance hatches. These scratches are texture overlays, subtle visual wear placed by artists to imply frequent use. They don't animate. They don't respond to interaction, but they create the illusion of history. There's a diner outside Lexington where plates are set on tables with half-eaten meals. The food models include bite marks sculpted into them. These details are baked into the mesh, meaning someone sculpted a 3D model of partially eaten pie for a location that has no quest attached to it. Some terminals contain entries written in casual tone, complaints about coworkers, jokes about management, arguments about shift schedules. These entries rarely tie into gameplay. They simply exist as fragments of ordinary lives. In one house in Concord, you can find a crib tipped over with alphabet blocks scattered nearby. The blocks spell nothing. Their placement is random within a small collision box, but their presence adds quiet weight to an otherwise empty room. Street signs in Boston often have minor spelling distortions or faded paint effects. These are texture details layered manually. If you look closely, some letters are slightly chipped more than others, avoiding symmetry to make the decay feel organic. There's also a recurring environmental detail involving skeletons holding hands. You can find several pairs throughout the Commonwealth arranged this way. It's never acknowledged in dialogue. It's simply there, quiet and unmoving. In certain parking garages, you'll find cars with doors slightly open. The doors are not interactive. They are separate, static meshes posed that way. Their angle was chosen intentionally to imply someone left in a hurry. Now, let's talk about clocks. Most wall clocks in Fallout 4 are frozen at roughly the same time, shortly after 9:47 a.m. This reflects the canonical time the bombs dropped. But not all clocks are synchronized perfectly. Some are a few minutes off, implying mechanical drift even before the war. Trash cans often contain burnt magazines. These magazines have visible cover art, but you cannot pick them up or read them. They are set dressing, visual storytelling without mechanical function. There's a small detail involving playgrounds. Some playground structures in ruined neighborhoods still have brightly colored paint that hasn't fully faded. The paint shaders are intentionally more saturated than surrounding textures, drawing subtle attention without explanation. In Diamond City, some vendors have small personal clutter behind their stalls: photographs, old tools, folded blankets. These objects never move, but their placement suggests someone lives there, even if the game doesn't simulate it directly. If you look at certain billboards, you'll notice bullet holes layered over pre-war advertisements. These bullet holes are not dynamic damage. They are part of the texture. Someone placed them deliberately to show post-war vandalism. The Pridwin's interior contains tiny grease smudges near ladder rungs. These are texture overlays meant to imply heavy use. No one comments on them. They simply exist. Even something as simple as desk fans has hidden detail. Desk fans contain individual rotating blades modeled inside the cage, even though they never spin. And perhaps most quietly, some buildings contain light switches that do nothing. They are placed at realistic heights next to doors, but cannot be toggled. Their purpose is purely architectural realism. None of these objects grant XP. None unlock secrets. They exist as background, careful, quiet, unannounced, Fallout 4's world feels dense, not because every object matters mechanically, but because so many objects matter visually. They suggest interrupted lives, ordinary routines, morning coffee, office gossip, half-played chess games. The Commonwealth is filled with small, frozen moments, fragments of time preserved in clutter. And the more slowly you move through it, the more you begin to notice that even the most boring object was placed there for a reason, not to reward you, just to be there. Fallout 4 is not a quiet game, but most of its sound is subtle enough that you stop noticing it after a while. Tonight, instead of focusing on quests or factions or even objects, we're going to listen to the Commonwealth. Not the loud explosions or dramatic music cues, just the background audio quietly running while you explore. Let's begin with footsteps. Your character's footsteps change not just by surface type, but by footwear category. Light armor produces slightly softer step audio than heavy armor. Power armor uses a completely different sound bank with layered metallic impact and servo whine. What's more interesting is that the game blends footstep sounds depending on terrain transitions. If you walk from cracked asphalt onto dirt, you'll hear a subtle audio crossfade rather than a hard switch. Now listen to interior reverb. Rooms in Fallout 4 have assigned reverb zones. Vault interiors have tighter echo reflections than subway tunnels. Large warehouses have a longer decay tail on gunshots and footsteps. Even your own voice during certain dialogue moments is processed slightly differently depending on the cell's acoustics. It's subtle, but it creates spatial awareness without you realizing it. Rain has multiple layers. When it rains in the Commonwealth, you're not hearing one looping rain track. There are at least three: distant rainfall, nearby surface impacts, and roof impacts. If you're under shelter, the surface layer fades, but the roof layer intensifies. This makes standing under a metal awning sound distinctly different from standing in open rain. Let's talk about wind. Wind audio is location dependent. Open highways have more sustained wind loops. Urban areas add debris, rattle layers. Forested areas blend in leaf rustle. The glowing sea has a low-frequency wind rumble, layered with faint radiation crackle. These layers dynamically adjust based on cell transitions. Generators are not all the same. Settlement generators each have slightly different audio pitch values. If you build 5 identical generators, they won't hum in perfect unison. This prevents phasing and creates a more organic, mechanical ambiance. It's something you'd only notice if you muted all other sound and stood very still. In Diamond City, crowd noise is partially simulated. The crowd chatter isn't tied directly to visible NPCs. It's an ambient crowd layer that increases in density during peak in-game hours. At night, the layer reduces slightly. It creates the illusion of a larger population than what's physically present. Now listen to distant gunfire. The Commonwealth contains ambient distant combat loops, gunshots that aren't tied to actual events. These play randomly to suggest activity beyond your immediate area. The direction of these shots is simulated in stereo space, meaning they pan slightly left or right, depending on virtual origin points. Even silence is layered. In interior vault spaces, the silence isn't empty. There's a faint, low-frequency hum beneath everything. It's subtle enough that you don't consciously hear it, but if you turn off music and stand still, you'll notice the air never feels completely quiet. Let's discuss radios. The in-game radio stations aren't just music playlists. They include subtle vinyl crackle effects, layered differently depending on signal strength. When you move farther from a signal source, static increases gradually. It's not a binary on-off system, it's a sliding gradient. If you turn off the radio mid-song, The track stops abruptly rather than fading. This is intentional, mimicking physical radio behavior rather than cinematic audio design. Feral ghouls have breathing layers. Before you see them, you can sometimes hear faint rasping layered under environmental noise. These audio cues are intentionally mixed low, so they don't always register consciously. They're designed to create unease without obvious warning. In subway tunnels, dripping water is not looped evenly. Each drip is part of a randomized event pool. That's why drips feel irregular rather than rhythmic. The engine triggers them based on proximity markers rather than a simple timed loop. Listen to settlement defenses. Turrets emit idle motor sounds even when not firing. The pitch slightly rises when they detect threats. This pitch shift happens milliseconds before they rotate. If you pay attention, you can sometimes hear a turret noticing something before you see it turn. Power armor servos are directional. If you rotate the camera in third person while standing still, you'll notice subtle servo adjustments tied to joint movement. The sound isn't just triggered by movement keys, it's linked to animation frames. Ocean waves near the coastline use layered shore impact sounds. The farther you move from the waterline, the more the high-frequency splash fades, leaving only low rumble. In Good Neighbor, neon signs emit a faint electrical buzz. Each sign uses a slightly different buzz pitch to avoid audio repetition. It's barely audible, but if you walk slowly at night, you can pick it up. The Pip-Boy has micro sounds. Switching tabs produces tiny mechanical clicks. Opening it emits a faint latch noise. These sounds are mixed softly, so they don't distract from gameplay. Terminals produce a low CRT hum. It's most noticeable if you enter a room with multiple terminals powered on. The hum stacks slightly, but not perfectly, because each terminal instance randomizes its pitch by a small percentage. Even the player's breathing changes. If you sprint and then stop, your character breathes heavier for a few seconds. This audio effect is separate from stamina regeneration. It's purely atmospheric. Radstorms introduce a unique audio layer, Geiger counter crackle, mixed with distant thunder-like radiation pulses. The crackle increases in density, depending on your radiation resistance. Let's talk about doors. Vault doors have a specific multi-stage closing sound: mechanical slide, gear grind, then pressure seal hiss. Regular interior doors use a simpler hinge creak with randomized pitch. Metal doors in industrial areas have slightly heavier bass presence in their closing sound. In the glowing sea, ambient audio includes reversed wind samples layered quietly underneath standard wind. This creates an unnatural texture that feels slightly wrong without you knowing why. Water pumps in settlements produce faint, sloshing loops. If you build multiple pumps close together, their sloshes desynchronize over time. There's also a hidden detail involving nighttime crickets. Cricket audio fades in gradually after a certain in-game hour and fades out near dawn. It's not instantaneous. The fade is tied to the lighting cycle. If you crouch in tall grass, grass rustle audio plays, but only if you're moving. Standing still removes the layer entirely. Gunshots sound different indoors because the engine adds artificial echo tails. However, some small rooms have incorrectly flagged reverb zones, making them sound slightly too open. It's a tiny inconsistency most players never consciously detect. Finally, when you save the game, there's a soft UI confirmation sound that most people mentally tune out. It's brief, gentle, and neutral, designed not to interrupt immersion. The Commonwealth is alive with sound, not loud, dramatic sound, but quiet layers of wind, hum, crackle, buzz, footstep, breath, and distant echoes. Most of it exists below your awareness. And maybe that's the most relaxing fact of all, that even when nothing seems to be happening, the world is still softly moving around you. You just have to slow down enough to hear it. Fallout 4 is full of motion, but most players are always moving too, sprinting through streets, fast traveling between settlements, skipping dialogue, snapping into VATS for quick decisions. Because of that, many of the game's smallest animations quietly play out unseen. Tonight, we slow down. Let's start with idle animations. If you stand completely still in third-person view for long enough, your character doesn't remain frozen. There are subtle breathing cycles, slight weight shifts from one foot to the other, and small hand adjustments. These are looped animation states layered on top of the standard pose. They exist to prevent the character from feeling stiff, but they're easy to miss because most players rarely stand motionless. Companions have even more complex, idle behavior. Preston Garvey will occasionally rest his hand near his laser musket, even when there's no danger present. Piper adjusts her stance and sometimes looks off toward distant movement markers. Kate cracks her knuckles after prolonged inactivity. These animations trigger based on idle timers, not player interaction. If you constantly move, you interrupt them. Dogmeat has an entire set of non-combat idle actions. He scratches behind his ear, lies down, yawns, or tilts his head slightly if you're standing near a sound source. There's a rare animation where he spins in a small circle before sitting. It's weighted with a low trigger probability, so you might only see it if you spend several minutes in one location. Let's talk about vendors. In Diamond City, if you watch vendors long enough without initiating dialogue, they eventually shift into routine loops, wiping counters, reorganizing items, stretching their arms. Arturo at Commonwealth Weaponry occasionally examines a weapon in his hands, rotating it briefly before placing it back down. These actions are not interactive, they're simply atmospheric. Settlers, assigned to shops, perform similar routines. A settler at a bar will lean forward slightly and pretend to wipe the counter surface. The cloth doesn't move independently, it's part of the animation rig. But the motion exists to create the illusion of ongoing activity. Now consider power armor. When you exit power armor, your character performs a small foot adjustment after stepping out. It's easy to miss because the camera usually pulls away quickly. But if you stay in third-person view, you'll notice the armor frame shifts slightly after you leave it, settling into its idle state. Power armor also has subtle joint movements even while stationary. The knee pistons compress and decompress slightly when shifting weight. It's minimal, but it's there. Let's slow down near a cooking station. When your character uses a cooking station, the stirring animation isn't identical every time. There are small variations in hand placement and timing. These variations were added to prevent mechanical repetition. Workbench crafting also contains micro animations. If you rotate the camera while crafting at a weapons bench, you'll notice your character's fingers actually grip the weapon differently depending on modification type. Adding a scope triggers a different hand pose than attaching a suppressor. Now, let's observe NPC conversations. If you don't interrupt two NPCs talking in the wasteland, they eventually loop into idle gestures, scratching their chin, shifting posture, folding arms. These gestures are tied to dialogue lines, but they continue even when the dialogue finishes. It creates the illusion that conversations continue beyond scripted audio. There's a rare animation involving feral ghouls. If a ghoul loses sight of you and believes it's safe, it sometimes hunches lower and twitches slightly before resuming its patrol. This animation only triggers under specific AI states, usually when transitioning from alert to idle. In Good Neighbor, Hancock occasionally leans back against walls in a relaxed posture if left alone long enough. It's not tied to quest states, just idle timing. Let's talk about sitting. When your character sits in certain chairs, they don't instantly snap into place. There's a brief transitional animation where they adjust their legs. This animation is skipped if you move the camera too quickly, which is why most players never notice it. Sleeping also has a small detail. If you wake up after sleeping fewer than 8 hours, your character's rising animation is slightly quicker than a full rest. It's a small speed difference that reflects partial recovery states. NPCs react to weather through micro animations. During rain, some NPCs slightly hunch their shoulders. It's not dramatic, but it changes their posture subtly. This only triggers in exterior cells, flagged for rain response. There's also something interesting about robots. Mr. Handy units like Codsworth rotate their central body slightly when idle. It's a tiny oscillation, almost imperceptible, to avoid static presentation. If you watch turrets closely, their tracking animation has 3 stages: detection, tilt, rotation, alignment, and targeting lock. The targeting lock includes a very slight barrel vibration before firing. Even Brahmin have layered animations. Aside from their exaggerated two-headed chewing motion, they occasionally shift weight independently between heads. One head may dip slightly, while the other raises. It's subtle and often missed because players rarely stand still near Brahmin for long. Children NPCs have unique idle sets. They rock back on their heels more often than adult NPCs. It's an intentional animation choice to convey restlessness. Let's move to combat reloads. Not all reload animations are identical across weapons of the same category. Some weapons have minor timing differences depending on mod attachments. Extended magazines alter hand placement slightly during reloads. Grenade throws have a recovery animation that varies depending on whether you're standing or crouched. If crouched, your character steadies themselves with their offhand slightly longer. There's also a detail involving doors. When an NPC opens a door and walks through, they don't immediately let go. Their hand remains in contact with the handle until their movement state fully transitions. This prevents clipping, but it also looks more natural if you watch closely. Even facial animations contain hidden complexity. During dialogue, characters blink at randomized intervals. The blinking rate increases slightly if the character is flagged as stressed in that conversation branch. It's a subtle emotional cue embedded in animation logic. In settlement attack scenarios, settlers sometimes flinch before bullets actually land. This pre-hit flinch is triggered by proximity detection rather than impact. Now, let's end with something quiet. If you stand at the edge of a settlement at sunset and don't move, you may notice NPCs gradually transitioning from active routines to nighttime behaviors, stretching, walking more slowly, eventually heading toward beds. It doesn't happen instantly. It unfolds gently over in-game minutes. Fallout 4 is full of these tiny motions, movements you don't see because you're always walking forward, animations that only exist for players patient enough to stand still. And maybe that's the most relaxing fact about the Commonwealth, that even when you stop moving, it doesn't. It keeps breathing. It keeps shifting, quietly, patiently, waiting for you to notice. Most players open the Pip-Boy map to fast travel. A quick glance, a marker selected, a loading screen. But the Fallout 4 map contains small, almost unnoticeable details that only appear if you slow down and stare at it longer than necessary. Let's begin with elevation shading. The Pip-Boy map isn't just a flat image of Boston. It's a 3D terrain render compressed into a stylized projection. If you rotate and zoom carefully, you'll notice subtle height variations, hills raised slightly, valleys dipped lower. These are simplified, but they mirror the actual terrain mesh beneath the world. The glowing sea region has slightly darker contouring compared to surrounding areas. This isn't only aesthetic, it's meant to visually suggest instability and crater density without explicitly marking it. Some roads on the map are intentionally incomplete. Certain highway routes fade into nothing or break midline. These reflect destroyed overpasses in the physical world. It's environmental storytelling baked into cartography. Let's talk about icons. Not all location icons are identical. Settlement icons subtly change once claimed. Vault icons have a slightly different pixel weight compared to factories. The differences are small, 1 or 2 pixels thicker in certain lines, but they exist to help visual parsing subconsciously. The map's color tone shifts slightly depending on in-game time of day. At night, the green hue deepens marginally. It's not dramatic, but it reduces visual glare and simulates low-light Pip-Boy mode. Now zoom all the way in. At maximum zoom, some map textures appear slightly blurred. That's because the Pip-Boy map uses layered resolution levels to save memory. The highest zoom isn't infinitely detailed. It swaps to a higher resolution texture, but only within a certain limit. There are also tiny inconsistencies in how water is displayed. Bodies of water have slightly thicker outlines compared to land borders. This is to prevent thin rivers from disappearing visually at certain zoom levels. Fast travel markers don't snap perfectly to geometry. Some markers float slightly off-center from actual building entrances. This is intentional. They're placed in accessible nav mesh positions rather than exact door coordinates. Unmarked locations exist on the map before you discover them, just not labeled. If you zoom and pan carefully, you can sometimes see subtle shapes that correspond to future discoverable areas. They're not clickable, they're simply terrain hints. The railroad tracks on the map aren't perfectly aligned with in-world tracks. They follow a simplified spline path. It's cleaner visually, but slightly less accurate. Let's talk about boundaries. The playable map boundary is not a perfect rectangle. It's irregular. The Pip-Boy map crops visually to a soft edge that doesn't perfectly match the collision boundary in-game. There are spots where the visual map extends slightly beyond where you can physically walk. Now consider discovered versus undiscovered shading. Undiscovered areas are darker, but they aren't fully hidden. You can still make out terrain outlines. This design choice prevents total disorientation while still encouraging exploration. There's also something subtle about quest markers. Active quest markers pulse slightly, not through animation, but through brightness cycling. It's extremely faint. Most players never consciously register it. If you stack multiple custom markers in one area, they overlap with slight transparency blending. The transparency isn't full alpha, it's partial to maintain readability. Even the cursor movement has detail. When you move the map cursor, it accelerates slightly over time, rather than staying constant speed. This makes large pans smoother. Now let's look at world map versus local map. The local map inside buildings uses a simplified projection of interior meshes. These projections are automatically generated but manually adjusted in some complex areas. That's why certain interiors have cleaner outlines than others. Some local maps show inaccessible rooms, faintly outlined, rooms that exist in geometry but are blocked off. They remain faint silhouettes. There are also subtle rotation differences between the world map orientation and certain interior cell orientations. This sometimes causes disorientation when exiting buildings, a quiet side effect of cell alignment. Let's talk about undiscovered vaults. Even before you discover Vault 81 or Vault 95, their terrain imprint exists faintly on the world map as slight circular depressions or structures. It's barely noticeable unless you're deliberately looking. Ocean boundaries fade gradually into blank space. The map doesn't show hard edges for the ocean. Instead, it softly reduces detail as it approaches the outer limit. The Pip-Boy map sound effect, that faint digital sweep when opening, includes a reversed audio tail layered quietly at the end. It's subtle and lasts less than half a second. If you spam the map open and closed quickly, you may notice the sound effect occasionally overlaps slightly. It's not perfectly gated. There are also unused map markers in the game files. Some correspond to cut content. They never appear naturally, but remain defined in the data. Zoom speed differs slightly depending on controller versus mouse input. Controller zoom increments are step-based. Mouse zoom is smoother and more granular. If you place a custom marker and then rotate the map rapidly, the marker redraws fractionally after the terrain layer. It's a one-frame delay, almost invisible, but technically present. Settlement supply lines are not shown on the default map unless toggled. Even then, they appear as simple straight lines, not accurate path routes. Weather has no visual impact on the map. Radstorms don't alter map shading, even though they dramatically change in-world visibility. The map grid itself is faint and only visible at certain brightness levels. On darker monitors, many players never notice the grid overlay. And finally, when you exit the Pip-Boy map, the screen brightness transitions over a few frames rather than instantly returning to gameplay. It's a very short fade, but it's there. The map is quiet. It doesn't shout at you. It doesn't reward prolonged attention. It exists as a functional tool. Yet even here, beneath the green glow and simple icons, there are layers of tiny decisions, design compromises, and hidden details. Most players open it for a second. Few linger long enough to see its small imperfections. But if you do, you'll notice that even the map, the simplest interface in the game, carries its own subtle texture of thoughtfulness. And then you close it again and keep walking. Fallout 4 introduced a fully voiced protagonist and a significantly upgraded facial animation system compared to previous entries in the series. Most players notice this in the opening moments: the character creator, the bathroom mirror, the slow pan across familiar suburban life. But after those first minutes, faces become background again. NPCs talk. You click dialogue. You move on. Tonight, we're slowing down long enough to actually look at them. Let's begin with blinking. Every NPC in Fallout 4 has a randomized blink interval. It isn't tied to dialogue pacing. The engine uses a timing range with slight variation so characters don't blink in sync. Stressful dialogue branches increase blink frequency slightly, but not enough to be obvious. It's one of those details that feels natural because it isn't perfectly consistent. Now look at mouth movement. Fallout 4 uses a phoneme-based lip sync system. Instead of generic mouth flaps, characters' mouths shape differently depending on sound. However, because it's automated rather than fully hand-animated, some consonants look exaggerated while softer syllables blend together. It's subtle, but if you stare long enough, you'll see how the system predicts speech. Skin textures also vary, more than you might expect. Freckles, blemishes, faint discoloration, many NPCs have texture overlays that are randomized within preset boundaries. That's why two settlers using the same base face preset still look slightly different. Let's talk about eye movement. During dialogue, NPCs don't stare perfectly still. Their pupils shift microscopically, especially during longer lines. This prevents the unsettling effect of unbroken eye contact. It's easy to miss unless you intentionally hold the camera steady. Companions have distinct, idle facial expressions. Piper has a faint half-smirk resting expression. Nick Valentine's synthetic face has slightly stiffer cheek movement due to his exposed mechanical design. Curie blinks a little more frequently than average NPCs once she's in synth form. Wrinkles behave differently depending on lighting. In bright daylight, wrinkle maps appear more pronounced due to shadowing. In interior lighting, they soften slightly. The engine doesn't dynamically change wrinkle textures. It's simply how light hits normal maps. Let's look at children NPCs. Their facial proportions are intentionally slightly exaggerated compared to adults, larger eyes relative to head size. This is subtle, but helps them read clearly from a distance. Beards and facial hair are not separate physics objects. They're texture overlays mapped onto face geometry. That's why extreme lighting sometimes makes beards look slightly flat. Scars have different depth properties. Some scars are purely texture-based. Others include slight geometry deformation. The difference is visible if you rotate the camera slowly under directional light. NPC teeth are modeled but simplified. In some lighting angles, teeth appear as a flat, bright shape. That's because they use minimal geometry with strong highlight shaders. Let's talk about dirt. Many wasteland NPCs have dirt overlays applied with uneven opacity. Dirt isn't symmetrical. One cheek might be slightly darker than the other. This randomness was manually tuned in presets. Now consider aging. Older NPCs use layered wrinkle maps combined with slight eye bag shading. These aren't separate models, just texture variations. If you zoom extremely close using console commands, you can see tiny seam lines where face textures meet neck textures. These seams are hidden under normal camera distance. Dialogue camera framing matters. When speaking to NPCs in tight spaces, the camera adjusts to avoid clipping into walls. This sometimes results in slightly off-center framing, which makes faces feel less symmetrical. The protagonist's facial animation differs subtly between male and female versions. Their neutral mouth positions are slightly different. The male character has a marginally lower resting lip line. Emotion presets during dialogue use blend shapes. If an NPC is angry, the brow furrows using a preset morph target. These morph targets are reused across many characters, which is why some expressions look similar between different NPCs. Hair physics are limited. Longer hairstyles move slightly during head turns, but not fully dynamically. The motion is tied to animation bones rather than real-time cloth simulation. Let's observe Diamond City security. They use a shared face preset pool with small, random adjustments. That's why guards sometimes look similar, but not identical. The mayor's face has slightly stronger specular highlights than standard NPCs. This makes him appear slightly more polished in well-lit areas. Synth NPCs have smoother skin shading with fewer blemish overlays. This is intentional, even if you don't consciously notice it. When NPCs are in shadow, the engine reduces eye highlight reflection. This makes their eyes appear darker and less reflective. Settlers recruited via radio beacon draw from a face template pool, but the game randomizes small sliders within those templates. Freckles don't scale dynamically with skin tone. They're separate overlays. Let's talk about death states. When NPCs die, their facial expression relaxes into a neutral morph. Eyelids close automatically if they die in ragdoll state. During certain intense conversations, characters lean slightly forward, not just body movement, but subtle chin lowering. NPCs occasionally lick their lips during idle animation. It's rare and weighted low. Smiling animations differ between friendly and sarcastic dialogue. The sarcastic smile uses a slight one-sided mouth lift. If you wear sunglasses, your character's eye movement still animates underneath, even though you can't see it. Beard stubble is a separate texture overlay from full beard presets. Some NPCs in Vault 81 have slightly cleaner skin shaders compared to Wasteland NPCs. If you rotate the camera during dialogue, NPC eyes attempt to track the camera slightly. Face shadows in candlelit interiors flicker subtly due to dynamic light sources. The protagonist's face in third-person cutscenes sometimes lags one frame behind dialogue lip sync. Noses have slight geometry differences that affect how shadows fall under them. Most players think about weather in Fallout 4 only when it becomes inconvenient. A radstorm rolls in, visibility drops, the Geiger counter starts ticking. Maybe you duck inside, maybe you ignore it. But the Commonwealth's weather system is far more layered than it first appears, and almost none of it revolves around you. Let's begin with transitions. Weather in Fallout 4 doesn't switch instantly. It blends. There's a hidden transition window where two weather states overlap. During this period, lighting, skybox textures, cloud density, and ambient audio gradually shift. It can take several in-game minutes for the transition to fully complete. If you stand still and watch the sky during a clear to cloudy change, you'll notice cloud textures sliding at different speeds across different layers. There are foreground clouds and distant skybox clouds. They don't move in perfect sync. Now consider fog. Fog density isn't evenly distributed. In certain low-lying areas near rivers or marshland, fog layers sit slightly heavier due to region flags. It's not dynamic physics fog, it's manually tuned per area. The glowing sea uses a completely separate weather table. Its radstorms are more frequent, but they're also visually different. The cloud color shifts slightly toward a yellow-green tint. Lightning flashes are less white and more muted. There's also a deeper, low-frequency rumble in the ambient audio. Let's talk about wind again, but visually this time. During heavy storms, debris particles increase slightly. Paper scraps, dust, and ash become more frequent. These are particle emitters placed throughout exterior cells. They activate conditionally. Rain doesn't leave puddles behind. There's no persistent water accumulation system. Surfaces simply switch to a wet shader while rain is active. Once rain ends, the shader fades out gradually. Sunrise and sunset are timed precisely. The lighting color temperature shifts gradually across the in-game day cycle. Morning light is slightly cooler. Sunset light leans warmer and more orange. These aren't just aesthetic changes. They affect shadow sharpness too. Shadows lengthen dynamically as the sun angle lowers. If you stand next to a tall building at noon versus sunset, you'll notice the shadow stretching dramatically. The moon exists in the skybox, but it doesn't follow a realistic lunar cycle. It appears based on preset sky textures rather than an astronomical simulation. Radstorms don't actually reduce NPC detection range significantly. While visibility decreases for you, NPC AI behavior changes very little. The atmosphere feels threatening, but mechanically, it's mostly cosmetic. Cloud cover affects brightness subtly. Even without rain, heavy overcast conditions reduce overall ambient brightness. This is achieved through light probe adjustments rather than full global illumination recalculation. There are rare weather variants many players never see. Some cloudy conditions only appear under specific seasonal flags tied to internal game time tracking. These flags are invisible to the player. Weather does not follow real-world Boston climate patterns. It follows gameplay, pacing, logic, designed to vary often enough to feel dynamic, but not so often that it becomes distracting. Let's consider lightning. Lightning strikes are visual only. They don't physically strike ground targets. However, lightning flash timing is randomized within a storm event. If you watch distant buildings during lightning, you may notice their windows reflect flashes slightly out of sync with the sky. This is because window reflections are a separate shader layer. Wind does not physically move trees dynamically. Tree sway is pre-animated and loops independently of wind intensity. Heavy storms don't increase tree sway amplitude. Rain audio continues, even if you enter shallow interior spaces like open garages. Fully enclosed interiors remove rain audio entirely. During radstorms, radiation damage is applied in periodic ticks rather than continuous drain. Cloud textures occasionally clip through certain tall buildings due to skybox layering limits. Most players never look high enough to notice. The night sky contains faint stars, but their brightness is toned down significantly compared to Skyrim's sky. The urban glow of Boston reduces star visibility intentionally. There are subtle color grading shifts between weather types. Clear days have slightly higher saturation. Storm days reduce color intensity. This is achieved through post-processing filters. Rainfall particle direction doesn't always match wind audio direction. This is a limitation of particle emitter orientation. Weather changes do not affect settlement crop growth speed. Crops grow on fixed timers, independent of rain. Sun glare intensity varies based on camera angle relative to sun position. If you look directly toward the sun, bloom increases slightly. The Pip-Boy light appears brighter in fog because of volumetric light simulation. Radstorm sky color is not uniform. There's a faint gradient shift toward the horizon. Weather does not change companion dialogue frequency significantly. Most companions have only a few weather-specific comments. Ocean wave intensity doesn't increase during storms. Wave animations are static loops. Rain doesn't extinguish fire barrels. Dust storms are limited to specific regions and do not travel dynamically across the map. Even something simple like cloud speed is tuned differently for different weather presets. And perhaps the most relaxing fact of all, weather continues whether you're watching or not. It doesn't trigger for you specifically. It cycles, blends, shifts. The sky darkens. The wind rises. Rain falls. Clouds drift slowly across a ruined skyline that doesn't react or change in response. The Commonwealth doesn't care whether you notice. It doesn't pause for you. It doesn't adjust itself around your story. It just keeps turning, hour by hour, light shifting across broken buildings. And if you stand still long enough, you might realize the weather feels alive, not because it's dramatic, but because it moves quietly in the background, even when you're doing nothing at all. At some point in every Fallout 4 playthrough, your inventory becomes heavier than your intentions. You pick things up automatically: desk fans, coffee cups, clipboards, burnt magazines. You tell yourself they might be useful later, and sometimes they are, but more often than not, they sit in a workshop storage menu, untouched for the rest of your journey. Pre-war money is one of the quietest examples of this. It has no weight, which makes it easy to hoard without consequence. It looks valuable, even important, but in reality it only breaks down into cloth, Its greatest strength isn't as currency, but as a crafting material for something as simple as beds or armor lining. Most players either ignore it completely or collect it absent-mindedly without realizing it's one of the more efficient cloth sources in the game. Pencils are another example. They break down into wood, just wood. Despite appearing in offices, classrooms, and government buildings all across the Commonwealth, they rarely become the resource bottleneck you hoped they might solve. They feel like they should matter more than they do. Desk fans, on the other hand, are quietly valuable. They contain screws and gears, components used in weapon modifications and settlement construction. Screws are one of the more commonly needed crafting materials, yet many players overlook desk fans early in the game, only to later wish they had picked up more of them. The same is true for typewriters, which also contain screws. They look like heavy junk, but they hold more long-term utility than many shinier items. Burnt textbooks and folders break down into cloth and sometimes plastic, but never paper as a separate crafting category. Cigarette cartons contain plastic and cloth. Individual cigarettes contain only cloth. These small differences are never explained, and yet they matter if you're paying attention to what you're actually collecting. Coffee cups break down into ceramic, a resource primarily used for settlement building. Ceramic rarely becomes scarce, but players still accumulate dozens of cups across hours of exploration. Spoons and forks break down into steel, one of the most abundant materials in the game. You could ignore them entirely and never feel the difference. Alarm clocks are one of the more quietly important junk items because they contain springs and gears. Springs are required for weapon recoil modifications and certain mechanical builds. Toy cars are small and easy to miss, yet they also contain screws. Hot plates provide copper, useful for wiring and generators in settlements. These are the items that look trivial, but quietly support more advanced crafting. Teddy bears break down into cloth, that's all. Despite the care placed into their environmental storytelling, posed at tables, arranged in strange scenes, mechanically they are just cloth. Their emotional weight far exceeds their crafting value. Fusion cores are heavy, whether full or partially drained. There's no weight reduction for used cores. Many players carry multiple depleted cores longer than necessary simply because they might need them later. Bottle caps, meanwhile, weigh nothing at all. The most important currency in the wasteland is completely weightless. Keys accumulate silently in your inventory. They never weigh anything, never disappear automatically, and rarely get removed after use. Over time, your key ring grows longer and longer, even though most of those keys will never be needed again. Weapons follow a similar pattern. Pipe pistols are everywhere early in the game, and most players replace them quickly. Yet they continue to appear in containers and enemy hands long after you've moved on to stronger equipment. Miniguns are iconic, but heavy, and ammunition hungry, often stored in settlements and never fired again. Fat Man launchers are powerful but impractical for most encounters, collected more for novelty than utility. Food items tell a similar story. Fancy lads, snack cakes, restore minimal health and add radiation. Mutt fruit is more useful for settlement happiness than personal healing. Nuka-Cola variants offer interesting stat boosts, yet many players forget to use them entirely, allowing them to stack quietly in inventory menus. Apparel pieces offer minor bonuses, a formal hat for charisma, a lab coat for intelligence, but players frequently forget to swap outfits before speech checks. Power armor pieces degrade independently, meaning a damaged arm doesn't disable the entire suit. Yet many players exit power armor entirely rather than repair a single piece. Gold watches break down into gold, but gold is rarely required in high quantities. Crystal decanters break into glass and crystal, with crystal mainly used for advanced optics or high-end settlement objects. Antique globes contain cork and plastic, resources that are seldom in short supply. Holotapes remain in your inventory permanently unless manually dropped. They weigh nothing, but they accumulate. Bobby pins also weigh nothing, yet break based on lock difficulty. Cap stashes can respawn after enough in-game time passes, a detail many players never realize. Settlement decorations don't all contribute to happiness. Some are purely aesthetic. Board games, burnt magazines, and scattered toys cannot even be scrapped. They exist to make the world feel dense, not to serve mechanical function. Steel is abundant. Adhesive and screws are the real crafting bottlenecks. Adhesive can be crafted through vegetable starch, a detail many players overlook until late in the game. Legendary weapons stack up in storage containers, each with unique prefixes, yet most players rely on only a handful of favorites. Fallout 4 fills your world with objects that feel important simply because they exist. You collect them out of instinct. You store them because you can. But in truth, most of them never change your story in any meaningful way. The Commonwealth is dense with things. Not all of them matter. Not all of them are meant to. Some exist simply to make the world feel real, cluttered, lived in, full of possibilities you may never pursue. And maybe that's the most calming realization of all. You don't need to pick up everything. You don't need to carry every fan, every spoon, every pencil. You can leave some things behind. The world will keep existing without them, and you can keep walking. Fallout 4 keeps track of far more than it ever explains. While you're wandering the Commonwealth, looting buildings, building settlements, or ignoring Preston's latest request, the game is quietly counting, recording, and updating invisible numbers in the background. None of these statistics appear on your Pip-Boy. None are summarized at the end. They simply exist, quietly ticking forward as you play. The game tracks how many locations you've discovered, but it also tracks how many times you enter and exit them. Each interior cell has a reset timer, usually around 7 inches game days for cleared locations and 20 inches game days for uncleared ones. If you don't revisit an area within that time frame, containers may refill and enemies may respawn. This isn't random. It's governed by a hidden cell reset system tied to your in-game clock. Sleeping, waiting, and fast traveling all advance this timer, whether you notice it or not. Fallout 4 also tracks your combat accuracy. Every bullet fired, every hit landed, and every miss contributes to an internal statistic. While this doesn't directly affect gameplay outcomes, it is recorded. The game knows how often you rely on V, A, T, S, how many melee attacks you've attempted, and how frequently you engage enemies from stealth. These values were originally designed for achievement tracking and balancing, but they continue accumulating quietly in every playthrough. Your affinity with companions isn't just a single number. Each companion has a hidden score that increases or decreases in small increments depending on your actions. Helping settlers, picking locks, using chems, stealing items. All of these contribute to invisible modifiers. The game even tracks repeated behaviors. If you continuously perform an action a companion likes, the gain eventually slows slightly. This prevents players from farming approval too easily, though most never realize it's happening. The game also monitors how often you fast travel. There is no penalty for it, but the statistic exists. Similarly, it records how many times you sleep, how many containers you loot, and how many terminals you hack. None of these numbers appear in standard menus. They simply exist in your save file, quietly accumulating as part of your story. Settlement attacks are governed by hidden probability calculations. Each settlement has a defense rating, food production value, water production value, and population number. The game uses these variables in a formula to determine the likelihood of an attack occurring over time. Even when you're nowhere near a settlement, the system is checking these numbers at regular intervals. It's not personal, it's math. The game also tracks how many times you've been detected while sneaking. Every transition from hidden to detected registers. This affects nothing directly, but it exists as part of the stealth system's background monitoring. Likewise, the game tracks how many successful sneak attacks you've landed. These values contribute to perk progression, but are also logged independently. There's a statistic for damage taken over time. Radiation damage, fall damage, explosive damage, all are categorized separately. The engine distinguishes between damage types, even if you don't consciously notice the difference. This is partly for balancing and partly for survival mode calculations. Speaking of survival mode, the game tracks hunger, thirst, and fatigue behind the scenes even before you activate survival difficulty. The systems exist in simplified form across all difficulties, but only become fully visible in survival. That means the framework for more complex survival mechanics was always present. Fallout 4 also records how many objects you scrap in workshop mode. It tracks how many structures you build, how many wires you connect, and how many settlers you assign to jobs. These numbers influence internal settlement metrics, but are not presented as lifetime totals. If you've ever wondered how much you've built across dozens of hours, the answer exists, just not where you can see it. Your reputation with factions isn't just tied to major quest decisions. Minor dialogue choices, side quests, and even incidental actions can adjust invisible faction standings. Some of these adjustments are so small, they're almost negligible, but they still accumulate. The game knows whether you leaned slightly more toward the Railroad than the Brotherhood, even if you never noticed the tipping point. There's also a counter for how long you've been in combat during a session. This affects certain ambient systems, like when the game decides to allow new random encounters. Extended combat periods reduce the likelihood of immediate new encounters spawning nearby. It's a pacing mechanism that works silently. Even the world itself keeps subtle track of your presence. Some random encounter spots won't trigger again if recently used. Others rotate through encounter pools based on prior activations. The game attempts to avoid repetition, even if it sometimes fails. Perhaps most quietly, Fallout 4 tracks how long you've stood idle. If you remain stationary for extended periods, certain ambient systems shift slightly. NPC idle behaviors cycle differently. Ambient audio layers become more noticeable. The world doesn't pause when you stop moving. It simply continues without you. There are also global counters for how many creatures you've killed by type: raiders, super mutants, ghouls, synths. Each has its own hidden tally. These contribute to achievements but persist beyond them. The game knows your habits. It knows if you avoid certain enemy types or prioritize others. Dialogue choices are stored not only as quest outcomes, but as individual flags. The game remembers if you were sarcastic frequently, even if it doesn't respond directly. These flags sometimes influence companion reactions in subtle ways. And then there's time itself. Fallout 4 tracks total playtime within a save file, but it also tracks in-game days passed. Seasons don't change. The world doesn't visibly age, but the number increases. Every wait, every sleep, every fast travel adds to that count. The Commonwealth doesn't reset when you log off. It simply waits for you to return. What makes all of this oddly comforting is that none of these tracked details demand your attention. They don't judge you. They don't alter the narrative dramatically. They simply record. The game observes your journey without announcing it. The Commonwealth feels chaotic on the surface. Raiders attacking, storms rolling in, settlements requesting help. But beneath that chaos is quiet structure. Numbers updating, flags toggling, counters increasing. You don't see them. You don't need to. They just exist, calmly, patiently, like a ledger of everything you've done. And as you wander the wasteland, building, fighting, collecting, ignoring quests, or simply standing still, the game keeps counting. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, keeping track of your time in the Commonwealth, one unnoticed statistic at a time.